She heard Brandon thank everyone who believed in him. She watched him sit down next to Janelle, not her. Then she saw, under the chandelier light, her own ring on Janelle's finger, and understood that she had already made every decision she needed to make. The ring was small, a rose gold band with a chip of garnet at the center, nothing expensive, nothing that would stop a room. Ada had bought it herself, 3 years before she met Brandon, from a jeweler on Broughton Street in Savannah who had known her father. She wore it on her right hand because she liked the weight of it, because it reminded her of something her father used to say when she was small and sitting on the porch beside him while he read, "Land doesn't lie, people do." She had not worn it to the dinner. She had left it on the bathroom counter that morning because the clasp on her earring had snagged the band, and she set it down to fix the earring and then forgot. Or she thought she forgot. Now she understood that the ring had been missing for 3 weeks, not one morning. She had told herself she was distracted. She had told herself a lot of things. The dinner was at Linden House, a restaurant on the north side of the city that had a private room on the second floor for events exactly like this one. 23 guests, low chandeliers, napkins folded into peaks, a jazz trio playing softly in the corner near the window that looked out over the wet street. Renata Calloway had reserved the room 6 weeks in advance. She had ordered the menu herself. She had written the guest list herself. She had not consulted Ada. Brandon had been promoted to regional director at his firm. It was a real promotion. Ada had told him she was proud of him. She had meant it. The pride did not cancel out the other things she had been noticing for the past 14 months, but it was real on its own, the way two true things can live in the same chest without resolving each other. Ada wore a dark green dress with long sleeves. Her hair was up. She had taken care getting ready, not because she wanted to impress anyone in that room, but because her father had taught her that how you enter a space tells people what you think of yourself, and Ada thought well of herself even in rooms that did not deserve her. The brass compass was in her evening bag, wrapped in a square of cloth. She had carried it every day for 2 years, since the afternoon her father pressed it into her hand at Memorial Health Hospital, room 314, without a word, without explanation. Just the compass, and his eyes, and the weight of everything the two of them had never needed to say out loud. She sat at the far end of the table from Brandon. That was where Renata had placed her, not at his side, where a wife sits at a celebration dinner for her husband. At the far end, near the door, between a man from Brandon's office, whose name she had been told twice, and a woman from the same office, whose name she had not been told at all. The food came. Ada ate. She listened to the conversations moving around the table like water, finding the path of least resistance, always flowing toward Brandon, always pooling at the center where he sat next to Janelle Pruitt, who had been described in Ada's presence as a colleague, then a friend, then someone Brandon was mentoring, a progression of language that had each time been offered to Ada like a small test to see if she would object. She had not objected. Not because she did not see, because she was waiting to understand the full shape of the thing before she named it. The host of the evening, a man named Gerald who worked in Brandon's firm's upper management, stood and asked Brandon to say a few words. Brandon stood. He buttoned his jacket. He lifted his glass. He looked around the table with the expression of a man who has been imagining this exact moment for years and is now watching himself perform it in real time. "I want to thank everyone who actually believed in me," he said. He sat down, next to Janelle. Ada did not move. She set her soup spoon down without a sound. She looked at the tablecloth for a moment, and then looked up, and that is when she saw it. The ring, her ring, the rose gold band with the garnet chip, sitting on Janelle's right hand, catching the chandelier light as Janelle reached across Brandon to take a piece of bread from the basket between them. A casual reach, an unconscious gesture. Janelle did not even look at Ada. The ring was simply there, on a hand that was not Ada's, in a room where Ada was sitting. Then Renata stood. Renata had the posture of a woman who had spent decades making sure rooms knew she was in them. She smoothed her jacket. She produced a cream-colored envelope from her inside pocket, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed the gesture. She smiled at the table, not at Ada, at the table as a unit, as a room full of witnesses. "I wanted to do something special for my son on this occasion," Renata said. "A little gift. For the next chapter." She set the envelope down in front of Janelle. Not Brandon, Janelle. The table went slightly quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something is happening that most people can see but have not been given permission to name. Marcus Calloway, Brandon's older brother, lifted his glass and said cheers, and the room resumed its motion. Tanya Calloway Webb, Brandon's sister, looked at Ada for a fraction of a second, then looked at her wine, then drank. Inside the envelope, Ada could not see, but she would find out later, from a card Renata had given Marcus to hold on to, that the envelope contained a booking confirmation for a suite at a hotel in Paris for 2 people, under 2 names that were not Brandon and Ada Calloway. Ada picked up the brass compass from her bag under the table. She did this quietly, beneath the tablecloth, unseen. She closed her hand around it. The metal was cool and heavier than you expected from something that small. She folded her napkin. She placed it on the table beside her still full plate, smoothed flat, edges aligned. She pushed her chair back without scraping it. She stood, and she walked to the door, and she went out into the hallway. She did not say anything to Brandon. He did not look up. In the hallway, she stopped beside the window at the end of the corridor. Rain was moving down the glass in slow, uneven lines. She opened her hand and looked at the compass. The needle had settled. It was pointing south. It always pointed south. It was a compass. That was what it did. She stood there for a long time, not crying. She had moved past the place where this would make her cry. She was in a different place now, the place her father had been trying to prepare her for since she was old enough to understand that the world would eventually show her its true face, and she would have to decide what to do with what she saw. She took out her phone. She scrolled to a name. She pressed call. On the second ring, a man's voice answered. "Reggie," she said. "It's Ada. Start the paperwork. I think we both knew this was coming." "I'll have everything ready by Thursday," Reginald Osei said. She hung up. She put the compass back in her bag and walked down the stairs and out of Linden House into the rain, and she did not go back upstairs for her coat because the coat was not worth the return. To understand who Adaze Nwosu Calloway was, you have to go back to a red brick house on Magnolia Court in Savannah, Georgia, where a man named Chukwuemeka Nwosu raised his only daughter with a patience so complete it never announced itself. Everyone in the neighborhood called him Papa Ek. He drove a gray pickup truck with a cracked windshield he kept meaning to fix. He wore the same canvas jacket from October through March for 15 years. He mowed the lawn on Saturdays, not just his own, but the one belonging to Mrs. Dorothy Ware, who was 81 and had a bad hip and never asked him to and never thanked him, and he did it anyway. He sat on the back porch every evening from 6 until dark, reading whatever he was reading that week, history mostly, sometimes law, occasionally poetry, and he drank 1 glass of cold water and listened to whatever birds were still awake. The neighborhood thought he was a retired civil servant. Some people thought he worked maintenance at the school district. He was quiet about his past and his finances in the way that some men are quiet about both, not out of shame, but out of a philosophy so deeply held it had become invisible to him. He did not believe that wealth should walk in front of a man and introduce him. What Papa Ike actually was, behind the canvas jacket and the cracked windshield, was the founder and sole owner of Nwosu Land Trust, a private real estate holding entity that owned and operated commercial, industrial, and agricultural properties across 6 states in the South and Midwest. The trust was worth $47 billion. It had never appeared in a press release. His name had never appeared in a public filing. Every asset sat inside a layer of limited liability, companies nested inside, holding companies nested inside the trust structure that Reginald Osei had spent 19 years building and maintaining on his behalf. Papa Eke had been born in Enugu, in southeastern Nigeria, to a family who had lost their land to a dispute that was never resolved in their favor. His father had taught him nothing about land, except that losing it was the worst thing that could happen to a family, and that the only protection was to own what could not be taken from you through a handshake or a misremembered agreement or a signature you gave without reading the document first. He came to the United States at 23 with a suitcase and a working knowledge of 3 languages and a habit of saving. He took whatever work was available. He read at night. He bought his first piece of land, a quarter-acre lot in a depressed county outside of Macon, for $11,000 when he was 28 years old. The lot was not special. It did not have a view or a legacy. It was just land, and it was his, and no one could take it through a handshake. He bought another piece the next year, then another. He was patient in the way that only people who have witnessed loss can be patient, not the patience of someone waiting for things to get better, but the patience of someone who understands that the process of getting things right takes exactly as long as it takes, and not a day less. By the time Ada was born, Papa Eek had assembled the foundation of what would become the Nwosu Land Trust. He did not tell her. He chose not to tell her the way a gardener chooses not to tell a seedling about the sun. The seedling will find the sun on its own. The gardener's job is to make sure the soil is right. He raised Ada to read contracts before she signed them, not as a lesson, not as a formal instruction, but because when a form came in the mail for anything at all, the insurance renewal, the school permission slip, the library card, he sat down and read every line before he touched the pen. He never made a performance of this. He never said, "Pay attention, this is important." He simply sat at the kitchen table with the document in front of him and read, and occasionally drew a small pencil mark next to a clause he wanted to think about, and then finished reading and put the pen down and either signed or set it aside for another day. Ada watched this so many times that by the time she was 12, she read everything before she signed it too, as naturally as she tied her shoes. He raised her to say nothing about what she owned. This was also not a lesson. It was just that Papa Iki did not talk about his properties with the neighbors, and Ada did not talk about them either, because there was nothing to talk about. "What you own," he said once, and only once, "does not need an audience." On Sundays, sometimes, he drove her in the pickup truck to the edge of the county where the land opened up into fields, and he parked, and they sat and looked at the land without talking, and Ada understood, without being told, that there was something profound happening in those silences, something being transferred that could not be transferred any other way. The compass had been in the family for 2 generations. Papa Eek had carried it since his father gave it to him the year he left Nigeria. His father had bought it from a man in Lagos who made instruments and had engraved the word Nzube on the back in small, careful letters. The Igbo word for intention, for will, for the decision to go somewhere and mean it. Ada knew the compass existed. She had seen it once when she was 8, sitting on his dresser, and picked it up, and he had let her hold it, turning it over in her hands, watching the needle find north. He did not explain it. He watched her the way he watched everything, with attention that did not perform itself. The morning he gave it to her, she had not known it would be that morning. She had driven to Memorial Health the way she drove there every day that month, in the early morning before work, carrying a book they were reading together through the worst of the illness. She sat in the chair beside his bed in room 314 and opened the book to where they had left off the day before. He was awake. He looked at her. Then he reached without speaking to the drawer of his bedside table and took out the compass and held it across the space between them. She took it. He closed his eyes. 2 days later he opened them again, and he was more present than he had been in a week, and he looked out the window at the February sky and said, without looking at her, "Land doesn't lie. People do." She knew he was not talking to her exactly. He was saying it the way you say something true out loud one final time, so you can hear it leave your body, so it can exist outside of you, so it doesn't have to die with you. He was gone 8 days after that. She had met Brandon Calloway 11 months before her father's diagnosis at a commercial real estate conference in Atlanta. She had attended every year as part of the routine Papa Eke had established for the trust's management, to move through the industry without appearing to be part of it, to listen, to learn what was moving. Brandon was a mid-level broker with a good handshake and the kind of confidence that a room mistakes for substance. He was articulate and well-dressed and funny in a way that made other people feel included. She had liked him. She mistook the performance for the person. It was an honest mistake. Some performances are very good. She did not tell him about the trust. This was not deception. It was the same principle she had been raised on. You do not lead with what you own. You let people choose you, or not, on the basis of who you are. And if a man can choose you without knowing what you own, then you know something real about him. If he cannot choose you that way, then you know something real about him too. She wanted to know something real. The marriage was good for the first year and a half. Then it became something else. The change was not dramatic. There was no single event. It was an erosion, a gradual subtraction. The way a room gets colder, not because someone turned off the heat, but because the heat has been leaking out through cracks so small, you do not notice each one until the whole room is cold. Brandon stopped coming home for dinner, and then started explaining why, and then stopped explaining. He started arriving at events where Ada expected to be introduced as his wife, and instead finding herself introduced as his wife, with a half-second hesitation before the word that tells you someone is editing themselves. He stopped asking about her work, which he believed was a consulting position she had held for years, and she did not correct this impression. She had never lied about her work. She had simply described it in terms that fit comfortably inside his understanding of her. Then Renata moved in. Renata arrived with 2 suitcases after a falling out with her sister in Birmingham, and Brandon told Ada about it as a fact, and not a question, and Ada made up the guest room, and within 3 weeks, Renata had established herself as the authority on everything that happened inside the house. The kitchen was reorganized. The grocery list was rewritten. The household schedule was restructured around Renata's preferences and habits. When Ada cooked, Renata ate and said nothing, not thank you, not this is good. When Brandon came home, Renata lit up. When Ada came home, the room continued at the same temperature it had been. One evening at dinner, Renata looked at Ada across the pot of soup Ada had spent 2 hours making and said, in a pleasant voice, to no one in particular, I truly do not understand what Brandon saw, but love is mysterious. She smiled as she said it. The smile was the worst part. Not the words, the smile. Ada looked at Brandon. Brandon looked at his phone. That was when she first understood the full scope of her situation. Not the meanness, the silence. Brandon's silence was the thing. It was not the silence of a man who did not know what to say. It was the silence of a man who had already made a choice and had decided that not saying the choice out loud gave him the right to keep making it. Then came Janelle. Then came the late nights. Then came the Sunday morning when Ada walked into her own kitchen and found Janelle sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee. In Ada's kitchen, at Ada's table, wearing a comfortable familiarity with the space that told Ada this was not the first time and would not be the last. Brandon poured Janelle coffee that morning. He did not offer Ada a cup. He did not look at her. Ada stood by the counter and understood that she had become a fixture in her own house. Not a person, a fixture. Something that was there and taken for granted the way a good chair is taken for granted, noticed only when it is no longer there. She went to work. She called Reggie from the parking garage. She said only, "Start reviewing the separation of the marital assets from the trust accounts. I want a clean line." Reggie said he had been expecting this call for 8 months. The night of the dinner at Linden House, when she saw her ring on Janelle's finger, was not the night she made the decision. The decision had been made in that parking garage months earlier, when she heard her own voice say the words out loud and felt no grief in them, only clarity. The compass at her side was not guiding her. She already knew where she was going. She had known for a while. She was simply waiting for the moment when there was nothing left to save. That moment had arrived. On the 3rd Tuesday of March, at 7 in the evening, the Nwosu Land Foundation hosted its inaugural benefit event in the ballroom of the Meridian Grand Hotel. The event was ticketed and had sold out 3 weeks in advance. 300 people filled the room: business leaders, foundation directors, journalists, community advocates, and a handful of people who did not belong in any of those categories, but had come because the name Nwosu was attached to something significant, and they wanted to be present when significance announced itself. Brandon Calloway had seen the notice in the Savannah Business Chronicle on a Wednesday morning over breakfast. He read the name Nwosu and paused. He said nothing. He filed it away in the part of his mind where he kept information that he could not yet categorize. He mentioned it to his mother that evening. Renata read the notice herself and said that it sounded like an opportunity. She told Brandon to put on his good suit and take Janelle, because Janelle presented well, and this was exactly the kind of event where a man needed to look like he was already where he was trying to go. Brandon bought 2 tickets online. He thought, briefly, about the name Nwosu. He thought about the fact that it was Ada's family name. He concluded that it was probably a coincidence, the way people conclude things that are inconvenient to examine. He did not know that Ada had been named as the founding director of the foundation 6 weeks earlier in a filing that went through Reggie's office and through 3 law firms and through the trust administration, and then came to rest, finally, in a document that bore her full name: Adaize Nwosu Calloway, sole beneficiary of the Nwosu Land Trust, valued at $47 billion. He did not know because he had never looked. In 5 years of marriage to a woman whose family name was Nwosu, it had never occurred to Brandon Calloway to look. Ada entered the Meridian Grand Ballroom at 7:14. She wore a long-sleeved dress, the deep green of old-growth forest. No jewelry except the brass compass on a thin chain around her neck, visible against the fabric of the dress, small and plain and unmistakable to the one person in the room who knew what it was. She did not look for Brandon. She already knew where he was sitting. Reggie had shown her the ticket manifest that afternoon. She walked to the front of the room, spoke briefly to the event coordinator, accepted a glass of water, and stood near the stage. The room was full and warm and loud with conversation. Across the ballroom, at a table near the center, Brandon Calloway sat next to Janelle Pruitt in his good suit, scanning the room with the expression of a man who expects to find opportunity in it. Renata was 2 tables away with a woman from her church. Marcus Calloway was at the bar. Tanya had not come. At 7:30, Reginald Osei stepped to the microphone. Reggie was 61 years old, slight, deliberate in everything he did, including the way he approached a microphone. He placed his notes on the podium and looked at the room for a moment before he spoke. He had the manner of a man who has been keeping important things in order for a very long time and is comfortable with the weight of them. "Good evening," he said. "I want to take a few minutes before we begin the program to speak about the Nwosu Land Trust, which is the founding institution behind tonight's event, and about the woman who now carries it forward." The room settled. The Nwosu Land Trust was established over a period of 30 years by Chukwuemeka Nwosu of Savannah, Georgia, Reggie said. Mr. Nwosu built his holdings quietly, deliberately, and in accordance with a philosophy he held for his entire life, that the value of what a person owns should follow the value of who they are, not precede it. The trust holds commercial, industrial, and agricultural properties across 6 states. As of the most recent audit, the total valuation stands at $47 billion. The room was very still. On the screen behind Reggie, a map appeared. 6 states, highlighted, dozens of markers, industrial parks, agricultural tracts, commercial corridors, distribution facilities, storage infrastructure. 40 years of patient accumulation, rendered in a map projection on a hotel ballroom screen at 7:30 on a Tuesday evening in March. Mr. Nwosu passed 2 years ago. Reggie continued. By the terms of the trust, which have been in place for over a decade and are fully executed in law, the sole beneficiary and controlling director of all Nwosu Land Trust holdings is his daughter. Her name is Adaize Nwosu Calloway, and she would like to say a few words. Ada walked to the microphone. She did not look at Brandon's table. She did not need to. She had said everything she needed to say to Brandon through Reggie's office, through 47 pages of legal documentation, through the divorce filing that had been submitted to the court 3 days earlier. Everything that needed to be communicated between them had been communicated in the clean, unambiguous language of law. There was nothing left to say to him personally. There never had been. He had chosen not to know her, and that was his right, and he would live with what that choice had cost him. She looked at the room. "My father built this quietly," she said. "I have managed it quietly. Tonight is not a celebration of wealth. Tonight is a commitment to what wealth is actually for." She looked out at the room. The Nwosu Land Foundation will fund land access programs for first-generation black landowners across the Southeast, interest-free acquisition loans, legal support for title disputes, technical assistance for agricultural families. That is what this land was always meant to do. That is what he always intended. She paused. "My father used to say that land doesn't lie. Tonight is the beginning of using that truth to build something that will outlast all of us." She stepped back from the microphone. At a table near the far wall, a woman rose from her seat. She was 72 years old, small and upright, with white hair and a yellow dress, and the posture of someone who has spent a lifetime standing when it mattered. Her name was Celestine Hayward. She had spent 30 years advocating for black land ownership in the rural South. Ada had written to her personally, months ago, to make sure she had a seat in this room tonight. Celestine Hayward did not clap dramatically. She simply put her hands together and began. The sound was unhurried and deliberate, and the person beside her rose and followed, and then the row, and then the room. Brandon Calloway sat at his table and did not stand up. Janelle Pruitt was already gone. She had left quietly sometime in the 60 seconds between Reggie reading the trust valuation and Ada reaching the microphone, collecting her bag and her coat and her presence from the room, with the efficiency of someone who has done this exact calculation before and knows exactly what the number means and what to do when it changes. She did not say goodbye to Brandon. She touched nothing on the table. She simply was there, and then was not. Brandon sat in the sound of 300 people applauding and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives only when it is too late to be useful, what the last 5 years had cost him. Not the trust, not the $47 billion. He had never had that. He had never been close to having that. What he had had was a woman who had chosen him, quietly, completely, and had asked only that he choose her in return. That was all she had ever wanted from him, and he had not done it. He had looked at her and seen only what she appeared to be, and he had decided that appearance was not enough, and he had spent 5 years telling her so in 100 different ways. She had never argued. She had never broken plates. She had never given him a scene he could use to justify himself. She had simply become quieter and more interior. And one day the paperwork arrived, and she was gone. Renata Calloway stood at her table with a glass of champagne she had not touched, watching the screen behind the podium where the map was still projected, her eyes moving slowly from one marker to the next, and she felt something she would not name for a long time, a kind of vertigo that comes from realizing that the ground you thought was solid was never solid, that you had been standing on someone else's patience the entire time, and the patience had finally, quietly, run out. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in April, in a county court building with beige walls and fluorescent lights, and a judge who had seen this particular document, a standard dissolution with no contested assets, because there were no marital assets to contest, dozens of times. The process took 11 minutes. Ada signed what she was asked to sign. She shook Reggie's hand in the parking lot. She drove home. Brandon Calloway was removed from the marital home within 30 days of the filing. As the lease was in Ada's name alone, he moved into a furnished apartment across town. He went back to work. The work went poorly. He had the reputation now, the reputation of the man from the Meridian Grand, which the internet had assembled from the ticket manifest, and the timing, and 2 photographs someone had taken of his expression during Reggie's remarks, and which had been circulated for 3 weeks under a title that was not kind. His firm did not fire him. They restructured his territory, He began driving more and closing less. Renata moved to Charlotte to stay with her youngest sister, a woman she had not been close to for many years, and they were not close after this either, but proximity filled the space where closeness was supposed to go. She sent Brandon money when she had it. She did not call Ada. She had started to, once, from a number she thought Ada would not recognize. Ada recognized it. She did not answer. Janelle Pruitt moved to another city and was not a part of this story anymore. Marcus Calloway's brokerage practice continued at a level that was not failure and was not success, which is the worst kind of stagnation because it provides no reason to change anything. He sent Ada a text message 6 weeks after the Meridian Grand event that said only, "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." She read it. She did not respond. Some apologies are for the person giving them, not the person receiving them, and she did not begrudge him the gesture. She simply did not need it. 8 months after the benefit at the Meridian Grand, on a morning in November when the sky was soft gray and the air smelled like pine bark and coming rain, Ades Nwosu walked out the back door of the red brick house on Magnolia Court and sat down on the back porch steps with a cup of coffee in her father's white ceramic mug, the one with the small crack in the handle that she had repaired with a dab of food-safe glue because she was not getting rid of it. She had moved back into the house 2 months after the divorce, not because she had to, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had been raised in this house and it was her house and it smelled like him, like the particular combination of old paper and cedar and morning coffee that meant safety to her in a way no other place ever had. She had the estate, the one Papa Eek had built, the 40-room house on 60 acres of gated Georgia land with the oak trees he had planted 30 years ago. She went there for work, for meetings with Reggie, for the quarterly reviews of the trust accounts. She slept at the house on Magnolia Court. The Nwosu Land Foundation had received, in its first quarter of operation, over 400 applications from first-generation black landowners seeking assistance. Ada read every application herself before passing them to the review committee. She had hired 12 people to run the foundation's day-to-day operations. She had interviewed each of them personally. She was, by any measure, at the beginning of something significant, and she knew it, and she held the knowledge carefully, the way her father had taught her to hold good things, with both hands, close to the chest, without announcing it. On the porch step, the morning was still. A crow moved through the pine tree in the corner of the yard. The coffee was hot, and she held the mug with both hands and let the warmth come through the ceramic into her palms. On her knee was a folder. Inside the folder was the first approved application from the Foundation's review process. A family in rural Alabama, 3 generations on 30 acres of timber and row crop land, facing a title dispute that threatened to take what their grandfather had built. The lead contact was a woman named Beverly, who had written in the application's personal statement, "My grandfather always said the land would outlast the fight. We just need help getting to the other side of the fight." Ada had read that sentence 4 times. She reached up and touched the compass at her throat. She unhooked the chain and held the compass in her palm, the way she had held it 1,000 times. The brass was warm from her skin. The needle settled quickly, the way it always did, pointing south, the direction of home, the direction she had come from, the direction where everything that mattered had been waiting for her the whole time. She was somewhere else, trying to make something work that could not be made to work. She thought about him. Not about the estate or the trust or the foundation or any of the things that bore his name and would bear it long after the people who had tried to diminish her had been entirely forgotten. She thought about the man on this porch, in the canvas jacket, drinking his cold water, watching the light leave the sky with the patience of someone who understood that the light always came back. She thought about a Sunday drive in a gray pickup truck to the edge of the county, the windows down, the fields running past. She thought about the drawer of a bedside table and the weight of brass in her palm and eyes that said everything they needed to say without saying a word. She thought, "I think you knew. I think you always knew it would be exactly like this, and I think you understood something I am only beginning to understand, which is that the inheritance was never the land. The land was just the rest. What you gave me first was the ability to know myself when the world was trying to tell me I was wrong about that. She did not cry. She had done her crying, all of it, in the months after the funeral, in the small house, alone, with the envelope on the coffee table in front of her, and no one to call, and nothing to do but sit with the grief until it found its right shape. It had found its right shape. It lived in her now like a room in a house that you pass through every day, familiar, no longer surprising, just part of the architecture. She opened the folder. She read Beverly's application again from the beginning. She had read it twice before, once when it came in, and once the evening she brought it home from the office. Both times, she had set it down and come back to it. Not because the case was unclear, because it was exactly the case her father had built all of this to serve, and she wanted to sit with that for a moment before she acted on it. Beverly's grandfather had purchased 30 acres in Barber County, Alabama, in 1961, paying for it in cash from money he saved over 11 years, working 2 jobs. He had no lawyer. The deed was recorded by hand in a ledger at the county courthouse. Over 60 years, the family had farmed the land, paid taxes on it, buried 3 generations on a small rise at the back of the property, where the land sloped up toward a stand of longleaf pine. Now a title dispute had surfaced, initiated by a developer who had filed a competing claim based on a clerical error in a 1947 survey. The error was real, the claim was legal, and Beverly's family, without resources to challenge it in court, was 6 months from losing everything their grandfather had built. Ada had seen this story before in the application files. She would see it many times more. It was not rare. It was the entire reason this foundation existed. She picked up her pen. In the margin of the first page, she wrote 3 words: approve, call personally. Then she sat back on the porch steps of the house where she grew up, in the gray November morning, with her father's coffee mug and her father's compass and her father's land stretching out in every direction, and she listened to the crow in the pine tree, and she was still. A compass doesn't argue with the people who doubt it, it just points true. If you know someone who needed to hear this story, not for the money, but for the quiet, send it to them. Just one person. That's all.